Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of the Rainbow Radio podcast. Just need to close the windows where I am in the bucket. It's always better sound quality if I sit here in the bucket, and obviously then I close the windows and I limit all external noises. So yeah, I haven't done a podcast in a long time. I've just been crazy busy, hectically busy. And some of the reasons why I've been so busy, you'll hear during the course of this episode. But thank you for joining me. Thank you for keep sticking around. And yeah, today's obviously for those of you who's new to this channel, to this podcast, welcome to you guys. Welcome to the regular listeners also. And thank you for being patient, patiently waiting for another episode. I always enjoy coming out and chatting to you guys. Thank you. So yeah, for those of you who know, for those of you who don't know, I generally talk about issues that affects me in life, affects me personally, and I always try and give my input, give my viewpoint on certain things, on the topics that gets discussed. And I'm by no means an expert on any of the topics, but it is stuff that I've experienced, and therefore I feel I am equipped to comment on it. So yeah, that's just to get that out of the way. Because so often when people do listen to a podcast, they would expect they expect the person to at least have some idea of what they're talking about. And because I've experienced what I'm talking about, I think I'm the best person to chat to you guys about it. By no means am I saying that I'm an expert. I repeat, I'm not an expert, and I would actually encourage you guys, if you know some of the topics, if you've listened to some of the topics, if you're gonna hear some interesting facts and points during today's episode where you feel you've got some knowledge on, where you have where you've experienced it, please by all means share those thoughts with us. I encourage you to do so. Our WhatsApp number is always open, 084-915569, 084-915569. Alternatively, you're welcome to comment down below in the comment section of this podcast on the many podcast platforms that you might find it on. So yeah, in today's show, I'm going to talk about real estate. I'm going to talk about buying houses, buying a house, buying your house. Might not be your first house, but buying a house. Alright. So yeah, I've recently sold the previous property that I've owned and bought a new one. And there's some things that I've experienced, some things that I've learned during this process. It's a very, this time around, in fact, it was a lot longer from the date that you showed interest in buying the property to the point where we actually got the keys. It was a longer process. 10 years ago, for example, we bought a house, and it was the reason why we had to buy a place or get a place. When I say we, I'm referring to my wife, of course. The previous property, the previous place that we've rented, and rental is also a topic that I want to touch on. The previous place that we've rented was about to get sold, and we obviously were sort of desperate to get out. We had 2 kids at the time, and we didn't want the owners of the place that we rented to sell the place out from underneath us, and when we had nowhere to go. So we obviously browsed around, looked around in Atlantis itself for places. We didn't want to move out of Atlantis, so we looked around at property. We spoken to people, got in contact with an agent, because the agent, that's probably the way sellers work. When you sell a place, you don't want too many crookery going on, so you approach a real estate agent who's obviously registered with its respective boards, and you know for a fact that the deal would be legit, the sale would be legit. You as the seller would get your money, and the purchaser feels safe on the other hand, that because they're buying through an agent, that all those behind the scenes things, for the stuff in the background, getting it registered with the deeds office, getting the lawyers involved, and all those things will be taken care of, right? So we bought the place through an agent. That place got sold fast forward to 2022, we now have a new place. What does it take in order to get into the property market? I mean, we see adverts all over, on social media platforms, on houses that's being put up for sale. You see the board of the real estate agency or the property practitioners. So it is either sometimes because you're not in the market that you don't necessarily see those things, but once you're in the market for a place, obviously they pop up more. It's like, well, how can I say, if you want to buy a pair of tackies, if you don't have interest in the tacky, many people might have it, and you're not blind, but you won't see it. But the moment you show interest in that particular brand of tackies or that model of tacky, then the more you show interest in it, the more it pops up. Then you suddenly see people with them more. You suddenly get in contact with people who have them, or people who had them, or people who had them before, that kind of thing. So that's the way the property market works, I think. You might not have any interest because you're not in the market, and the moment you're in the market, then you see a lot of properties that just sort of stand out to you. One thing about getting into the property market, always, and you can speak to any real estate agent or to a property practitioner, as they refer to themselves nowadays. Before you can even talk about getting a place, buying a place, you need to know how much you qualify for. I mean, it's might sound simple, might seem simple, but it's not always that simple. So you as a person wanting to buy property, yes, you might want the fancy house with a 4-car garage, with a balcony, built-in braai, en-suites, pool, jacuzzi, big earth, all those kind of things. But the question is, do you actually qualify for that kind of property? So it's important to be honest with yourself, to check and see how much you qualify for. And where does this process actually start? If you work through an agency, it's always a lot easier, because the real estate agency, the real estate agent, nowadays known as the property practitioner, they'll hook you up with what is referred to as a bond originator. Now it's important that this bond originator comes into play, because this is the person who will get all your particulars from you. When I say particulars, I mean like proof of identification, so copies of your ID, proof of address, proof of your employment, pay slips. If you're self-employed, they also need some details from the business. So they take all these details and they, in the back end, do the necessary credit checks with the respective, what is this fancy word that they use? While they do credit checks, I've worked at a company before at M where we used to do credit checks on people, and we did those checks through I'm not even sure what these companies are called, but their names were either Experian or TransUnion. So those are the guys, credit bureaus. Is it credit bureaus? Well, the credit checks gets done through them, but the bond originator does that on your behalf if you work through the agency. You could probably approach a bond originator directly if you don't work through an agency, in the attempt to try and establish how much you qualify for when it comes to the property that you show interest in. I think it's probably good to note that you should first have an idea of how much you qualify for before you can actually have interest in the property. Does it make sense? It makes no sense in being interested in a property with a value of 3.5 million, but then you only qualify for 2 million, if that makes sense. So yeah, when I always refer to myself because I've went through it, I've experienced it, and I want to share my story with you. I showed interest in the property. The bond originator did the necessary checks with the credit bureaus and then established that I qualify for the property. So that is what I want to say to you. Try and establish how much you qualify for If you qualify for a 400,000 rand house, a 700,000 rand house, a 1.5 million rand house, establish that first. Make sure you know how much you qualify for. Now, there's a few things that leads up to you actually being qualified or qualifying for the property. One of which, of course, is probably fairly straightforward. You must have a good credit record. You must be able to be a person who pays their bills on time. When I say bills, I refer to those store cards, your Edgar's accounts, your sports scene accounts. Is your payments with Lewis up to date? Is your Woolworths payment up to date? All of those things gets looked at in order to establish whether or not you are a good lender of credit, whether they establish whether you're good, have a good record of paying back your credit. So it's very important to make sure that if you do have accounts, make sure that you square them up, pay them in full, have one, and if you do have one or two, make sure that you do actually pay them on time on a monthly basis, because all of these things reflects with the credit bureaus when they need to make their decision on whether or not they're going to borrow you money for the house. Right, so that out of the way is, for example, say they've established that you're credit worthy, they've established your credit rating, and they made sure they see that you qualify. Other question and another thing, and this is with you as a person. I'm not going to say how you should do it, but this lies with you as a person. What I always say to people, when you go into anything, have you got that habit of actually paying that credit back? Part of becoming having a good credit record is obviously paying your bills back on time. But when it comes to property, it's a different ball game. A simple example would be if you've always lived rent-free, if you've always lived where you didn't have to pay monthly for your monthly accommodation. I think it's important. This is not something that I say people should do, but it's probably best if you get into that habit of paying a monthly, of paying for your monthly accommodation first. Try and establish that habit. Try and build that habit of having to pay for monthly accommodation. The reason why I say you should try and do that is simple, because if you live in a place, and this is a hypothetical example, if you live in a place where you pay a rental of 1,500 rand a month, right? Let's say you've lived there for 6 months, you now move over to a new place where the rental is slightly more expensive. But then again, over time, your work conditions have improved, you might have gotten an increase over a year or two, and you're able to have a bigger place instead of just a one-bedroom apartment. Now have a bigger place, but obviously with a bigger property size, the responsibility of paying back also increases on a monthly basis, right? So now you no longer pay for that 1,500 rand, you might now need to pay 2,000 rand per month. But that puts you into that motion where you slowly but surely realize, and you build that habit of having to pay the increased amount on the rental property, on the property that you're renting from. The same with buying a house. You can't just go and get that very huge expensive one if you're not in the habit of paying that monthly bond, for example, or monthly rental. Establish that habit first before you do anything. Make sure that you're in that motion. So from 2,000 rand a month, you maybe move up to a bigger place where you now pay 3,000 rand a month. And that 3,000 rand a month, you should probably stay there for what? 6 years, 8 years, probably 10 years. But the bottom line is get into the habit of paying the monthly bond. Once you got that, now you actually on a good what the monthly rental needs to be paid, and you are prepared for that. Those are my tips of advice I can give you for this afternoon. So A, establish how much you qualify for, and B, make sure that you're in the habit of paying the monthly bond, paying the monthly rental. Those are two factors that you need to get into, two factors that you need to be ready for when you go and buy property. We're going to check again next time soon. I need to head back to work. It's always a pleasure though. So if you got any questions, tips or advice for anyone, let me know. But I told you the number is always available. Or comment in this comment section below.